Before Shedeur Sanders ever declared for the draft, before his name lit up Colorado headlines, Todd Monken already knew what he was looking at. Back when Monken was still calling plays at Michigan, he tried to recruit Sanders, not because of flashy stats, but because of the intangibles: decision-making, emotional control, and poise under pressure. Fast forward to 2026, and that conviction becomes prophecy. As the Browns' new offensive coordinator, if you're into the real story and all the messy twists they don't show on highlight reels, go ahead and subscribe. And if you're sticking around to see how this Browns QB chaos plays out, you should definitely be subscribed. Monken named Sanders a starter without hesitation, ushering in a new era of trust and design built around a quarterback he'd been tracking for years. It wasn't a gamble. It was follow-through. That kind of long-term vision makes Monken's move more than a football decision. It's a full-system endorsement of who Sanders is and always have been. And it makes Grossi's apology feel more like a strategic retreat than a genuine shift in analysis. The real story here isn't about a media reversal. It's about a quarterback whose consistency, even in silence, outlasted every critic cycle. Tony Grossi spent months casting doubt on Shedeur Sanders, slinging criticism with confidence, and acting like Sanders was just another overhyped prospect. The tone wasn't subtle. He was relentless. Whether it was shading Shedeur's mental toughness, dismissing his NFL readiness, or, most infamously, mocking his honest admission of arm soreness in training camp, Grossi made his stance clear. Sanders wasn't his quarterback, and now he's walking it all back. Let's be honest. This isn't just some analyst adjusting his stance after new tape. It's not a case of Grossi seeing a new version of Sanders and thinking, okay, I was wrong. This is a full-blown reversal that happened the moment Todd Monken entered the picture. Not after a breakout performance. Not after a record-setting game. But right after Monken was hired and gave one of the most decisive quarterback endorsements we've seen in years. And that's the key here. This wasn't about Sanders changing. It was about the narrative changing. And that narrative didn't shift until someone in power finally said what Shedeur had already proven. He's a guy. Monken didn't waste any time either. From day one, he came in, looked at the quarterback room, and said, Shedeur Sanders is our starter. He didn't hedge. He didn't say we'll evaluate through camp or we'll see how the reps shake out. He said it like it was already a known fact. And for Monken, it was his belief in Sanders didn't start in Cleveland. It started years ago when he was at the University of Michigan actively recruiting him. That's what makes this different. Monken saw the leadership, the processing, the composure. Before the NFL hype, before the media circus. His endorsement wasn't just a coaching decision. It was a continuation of a long-term belief. And that belief changed everything. Before Monken, under Kevin Stefanski, Shedeur was treated like a ghost. Despite starting 7 games, Stefanski wouldn't name him in press conferences, wouldn't acknowledge his contributions, wouldn't even give him the standard PR spin most young quarterbacks get. It was erasure by omission, like Sanders didn't exist. That sent a message, not just to the public, but to the team, the fans, the media, and the media responded accordingly. They mirrored that silence. They didn't push. They didn't question why a first-round quarterback was getting ignored. They treated the silence as substance. That's how Shedeur went from a starting quarterback to a non-topic. Even after a 7-game stretch that showed steady, measurable improvement, Grossi led that charge. And when Sanders, in the middle of it all, had the courage to be honest about the physical toll of transitioning to the NFL, Grossi turned that into a punchline. Arm soreness. He took something that every quarterback deals with and framed it as fragility, as a sign that Sanders wasn't cut out for the league. But Shedeur didn't take it lying down. He didn't get defensive or spiral into some messy media feud. He confronted Grossi directly, more than once, in those tense post-game moments when most rookies just try to survive the questions. Sanders flipped the script. Calmly, clearly, he called Grossi out, not with hostility but with authority. He asked for fairness. He demanded consistency. He reminded the room that he was not going to be boxed in by lazy narratives. And Grossi? He brushed it off, kept the tone dismissive, until Monken spoke. That's what really exposed everything. Because Grossi's change of heart didn't come after some incredible preseason moment. It came the same day Monken named Sanders QB1. The timing was too perfect, too convenient. He wasn't reacting to Sanders. He was reacting to Monken. That tells you everything. Grossi's reversal wasn't driven by evidence. It was driven by alignment. As soon as the franchise signaled that they were all in on Sanders, Grossi followed suit. That's not objectivity. That's narrative survival. And it's a perfect example of how media credibility in the NFL is often just a reflection of coaching consensus. The real kicker? The facts never changed. The 7 starts under Stefanski were always there. The maturity in front of the mic was always there. The arm talent, the processing, the leadership, it was all on tape. But it didn't become part of the official narrative until someone with enough institutional weight put their stamp on it. That's what Monken did. He didn't just back Sanders. He built a case. He laid out his vision. He talked about Sanders' decision-making, his fit within the scheme, his long-term trajectory. This wasn't let's see how he does. This was we're building around him. And when a coach speaks like that, it forces everyone else to catch up. Grossi caught up fast, and that's why his apology, or whatever you want to call it, doesn't hit right. It wasn't earned. It wasn't rooted in newfound appreciation or understanding. It was reactive, tactical, a pivot that came not from reflection, but from pressure. Shedeur Sanders didn't need Grossi's approval to grow. He didn't need praise to perform. What he needed was a system that believed in him, a coordinator who understood him, a franchise that would speak his name instead of burying it. Now he has that. Monken's appointment wasn't just a coaching change. It was an organizational reset. It recentered the Browns around someone who actually wanted to develop a quarterback, not hide him. Someone who had watched Sanders for years and understood that greatness isn't always loud at first. And that's what makes Sanders' rise so satisfying. He didn't burst onto the scene with one highlight play and ride a media wave. He earned every step. He played through invisibility. He led through erasure. He stood his ground when others tried to minimize him. And now, he's starting because of what he's shown over time, not just in games, but in meetings, in preparation, in leadership. It took a coaching change for people to finally say it out loud. But the truth was always there. Grossi's shift doesn't rewrite the story. It just highlights how delayed the reaction was. It proves that media narratives don't drive football decisions. They follow them. And in this case, they followed Monken right into a new reality. Shedeur Sanders is QB1, not in theory, not in debate. In fact, so now the same people who once doubted are trying to pivot. The tone's changed. The headlines are warmer. And Grossi, he's along for the ride. But fans see it. Players see it. And most of all, Sanders sees it. He knows exactly who was with him when the spotlight was off, who believed in him before Monken made it official. And he knows who's just now climbing aboard because it's safe. Let us know where you stand. Did Grossi's turnaround come too late? Was Shedeur Sanders always ready, and the media just chose not to see it? Drop your thoughts below, like the video, share it with someone who's been watching the saga unfold, and hit that subscribe button. Because now that Shedeur's got the mic, the narrative isn't being written about him anymore. It's being written by him. And this time, everyone's listening. You'd think by now we'd be used to it. The moment a franchise makes a bold decision, the media, especially the ones who doubted it most, scrambled to reframe. And with Shedeur Sanders, the rewrite was instant. 1 minute, Tony Grossi is firing off critiques with the kind of confidence only long-term skepticism brings. And the next, he's suddenly a believer. All because Todd Monken dared to do what Kevin Stefanski wouldn't. Speak the truth plainly. Shedeur Sanders is our QB1. 7 words. That's all it took. Not a qualified maybe. Not a cautious we'll see. Monken didn't toe the line. He stomped on it. And in that moment, the Browns weren't just naming a starter. They were exposing how overdue this was. They were admitting, whether they realized it or not, that the narrative around Sanders had been mishandled from the jump. And nobody played a bigger role in that mishandling than Grossi. Let's not downplay this. Grossi wasn't just critical. He was consistent, relentlessly so. When Sanders spoke about arm soreness, something that's practically a rite of passage for young quarterbacks adapting to the physical toll of the NFL, Grossi twisted it into a talking point. Suddenly, it wasn't a sign of self-awareness or body management. It was weakness, fragility, as if Sanders admitting what his arm was telling him somehow meant he wasn't ready for the league. That wasn't analysis. That was performance. Because deep down, that kind of commentary only works when you assume the audience is hungry for confirmation bias, that they already see Sanders as a risky bet, that they're already primed to doubt. Grossi didn't create that atmosphere, but he fed it, publicly, loudly. And when Sanders started pushing back, he didn't lash out. He didn't play the victim. He confronted it, directly, not in off-the-record whispers, not through intermediaries, but right there in front of the cameras, in the same press rooms where Grossi had been shaping the story. Sanders didn't flinch. He calmly pointed out the inconsistencies, the unfair framing, the skewed coverage. And Grossi, he kept going, until he couldn't, because when Monken arrived, the entire power structure changed. Stefanski had kept Sanders in the shadows, refusing to even say his name, despite 7 starts. 7. In what other world does a starting quarterback become a non-topic for his own head coach? That silence spoke volumes. It gave cover to critics like Grossi. It created a void where speculation thrived. And Sanders, to his credit, filled that void with discipline, resilience, and steady performance. But it wasn't enough to move the needle, because silence from leadership sends a message. It says, don't invest. Then Todd Monken walked in and burned that message to the ground. Monken wasn't just naming a starter. He was backing his guy, with receipts. He talked about recruiting Sanders in college, about seeing traits other coaches had missed: arm talent, decision-making, poise under pressure, leadership you can build around. He didn't just talk about what Sanders could be. He talked about what he already was. That kind of belief doesn't just land. It shifts the entire gravitational pull of the franchise. And media figures like Grossi, they felt it immediately. Because suddenly, that same criticism that had once seemed insightful now looked out of step, out of touch, out of sync with the organization. And Grossi didn't want to be on the wrong side of that. So he adjusted, fast. Let's be real. There's a world where Grossi could have owned it, where he could have said, I underestimated the kid. I didn't give him enough credit. I misread the situation. And maybe some fans would have respected that. But that's not what happened. What we got instead was a soft pivot, the tone shift, the quiet distancing from the old takes. But we remember, we always do, we remember when Grossi acted like Sanders' transparency about soreness was a disqualifier. We remember when he treated the absence of Stefanski's praise as evidence rather than a symptom of a larger problem. We remember when Sanders had to advocate for himself in rooms where no one else was stepping up to do it. And we remember that Grossi didn't change his tune until it was safe. That's what this really comes down to, the safety of narrative alignment. Because once Monken made it clear that the Browns were all in on Shedeur, it stopped being risky to support him. And Grossi, like so many others, got in line, not because the facts had changed, but because the approval had been granted. This is how narratives get rewritten, not by evidence, but by proximity to authority. And the most frustrating part? Sanders had already done everything he needed to do. He had the performance, the growth, the leadership, the maturity. It just didn't register because the people in power weren't saying it out loud, until Monken did. And suddenly, Grossi heard it. This whole thing exposes how media narratives in sports are often reactive, not reflective. They don't shape the conversation. They follow it. They mirror what the organization projects. And when that projection changes, so does the coverage. Monken didn't just endorse Sanders. He exposed everyone who had waited to see which way the wind was blowing before picking a side. And now the shift is complete. Sanders isn't a question mark anymore. He's the face of the franchise. Not because he changed, but because someone with enough authority finally said what should have been obvious all along. That's what makes this story so compelling. It's not a tale of redemption. It's a case study in recognition. How long it takes, who gives it, and what changes once it's public. Shedeur Sanders didn't break out. He was never broken. He didn't redeem himself. He was never wrong. The only thing that changed was who was willing to say his name. And now that the name has weight, Now that it's backed by Monken's vision, by organizational clarity, by an offense designed around him, the media suddenly sees him, but he saw himself the whole time. And this is where things get real. Because now that the dust has settled and the bandwagon is fully loaded, the most important part of this entire saga remains unchanged. Shedeur Sanders never asked for anyone's permission to lead. He didn't beg for the spotlight. He didn't play politics. He didn't run to the media with complaints when his name was left off the roster conversations by Kevin Stefanski, week after week, like some kind of bizarre organizational oversight. Instead, he played quietly, competently, and with the kind of control that most rookie quarterbacks struggle to find even under ideal circumstances. But this was far from ideal. Let's not pretend otherwise. What Stefanski did was not just about being tight-lipped or coach-speak conservative. It was pointed. It was systematic. You don't start a first-round rookie for 7 straight games and somehow manage to not acknowledge his existence in press conferences unless there's a deliberate message being sent. And that message was crystal clear. This is not our guy. So what does a player do in that situation? Especially a young quarterback, fresh in the league, already under a microscope for every move he makes? Well, if you're Shedeur Sanders, you show up, take hits, make reads, grind film, and never once allow that institutional cold shoulder to shake your confidence. Not because you're arrogant, but because you know who you are, even when the room won't say it back to you. Which is exactly why the narrative pivot following Todd Monken's arrival was so stark. It wasn't just a tactical change. It was an emotional one. For the first time, someone in the building didn't just talk about Shedeur's game. They believed in it. They invested in it. Publicly. Enthusiastically. And without needing to be asked twice. Monken came in with a vision already mapped out in his mind. Not because he scouted Sanders for 2 weeks on NFL tape, but because he had known about Shedeur's game for years. When he was still calling plays at Michigan, he wanted Sanders in his system. Saw the poise, the decision-making, the raw processing speed that couldn't be coached. So this move, naming Sanders the Browns QB1 in 2026, was about rolling the dice on potential. It was Monken executing a plan he'd been ready to implement for a long time. And once he said it out loud, once he put institutional weight behind Sanders' name, the rest of the building had to fall in line. Enter Tony Grossi, because here's where the media mirrors the power structure. When Stefanski kept Sanders invisible, Grossi had no problem criticizing him. Not analyzing, criticizing. He took Sanders' openness about training camp arm soreness and turned it into a metaphor for quarterbacks' fragility. He weaponized honesty, which is rich, considering how often the media loves to say they just want athletes to be real. Well, Sanders was real, and instead of being praised for his professionalism, he got labeled as soft. But now, with Monken in control and the coaching staff loudly backing Shedeur, suddenly Grossi's reading from a new playbook. The same guy who used to downplay Sanders' leadership is now referring to him as a mature field general. The same analyst who raised questions about toughness is now applauding resilience. And he's not the only one. The entire tone of the coverage flipped the moment Shedeur gained institutional validation. Because that's how sports media often works. It's rarely proactive. It's reactive. This isn't a case of people finally seeing the light. This is a case of them finally following it. But Shedeur didn't need any of this to validate him. He knew who he was before the Monken endorsement, before the Grossi apology, before the entire media landscape caught up to what he'd been showing all along. And the fact that he didn't crack under the weight of that erasure, that he stayed calm, focused, and even challenged his critics in real time, speaks louder than anything Monken or Grossi could have ever said. Let's not skip past that either. Sanders confronting Grossi directly in those post-game pressers was not some petty beef. It was a boundary. It was a reminder that quarterbacks aren't just game managers. They're narrative managers. And Shedeur wasn't going to let someone else write the story of his career before it even started. Especially not when the story was built on misrepresentations and low-effort skepticism. And still, he didn't make it personal. He didn't attack. He held his ground, calmly and precisely. That's leadership. Because here's the thing, quarterbacks get measured by everything. Arm strength, footwork, reads, stats. But what about emotional control under pressure that isn't just on the field, What about the pressure of being publicly diminished by analysts who aren't doing their homework? What about maintaining composure when your own head coach won't even acknowledge your contributions? Shedeur passed every one of those tests. Long before Grossi's public tone softened, long before Monken gave him the keys to the offense. And now we're in a new chapter. The coach believes in him. The team is being tailored around him. And the same media figures who once doubted him are trying to rewrite their own roles in the story. But we've got receipts. This wasn't a comeback. It was a correction. A system correcting itself after ignoring a reality that had been obvious to anyone actually paying attention. So what happens next? That's the exciting part. Because now, for the first time, Sanders has the structure to match the skill. Monken isn't just a believer. He's a builder. He's constructing an offense around Shedeur's strengths. And that's not just about maximizing Sanders. It's about eliminating the excuses. No more uncertainty. No more PR silence. No more narrative hiding places for critics who want to play both sides. Grossi's already shown that once the institutional mood shifts, the analysis changes too. But the real story isn't about the apology. It's about the consistency Shedeur showed when no one else was willing to give him that same respect. So if you've been following every turn of the story, now's your moment to weigh in. Do you think Grossi's reversal was sincere or just a calculated move to stay on the right side of public opinion? Was Stefanski's handling of Sanders a leadership failure? And more importantly, what does this new era mean for the Browns now that Sanders finally has an offense and a staff built around him? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit that like button. Subscribe for the next chapter, because this isn't just about one quarterback redemption arc. This is a case study in how talent, when properly recognized and developed, can expose everything that stood in its way. And Shedeur Sanders? He never needed saving. He just needed someone to say the truth out loud. Now they have, and now the league has to listen.